Seems okay, cool. So this is my second progress review, as Neil mentioned. A bit of context about this project. Generally, I'm part of the QUEX program, which is a collaboration between University of Exeter and University of Queensland. And also, it's worth noting that this is also in line with a more industry-oriented project, and hopefully this project also contribute to that. But the idea behind this is to find a bit of a context about desalination in light of the ongoing water and food crisis. How can we explore and expand this technology for irrigation purposes, for instance, in a more sustainable way? So for the next 30 to 40 minutes or so, I'll do my best to go over what I've done in the last 2 years, and more importantly, talk about my plans for the next remaining of my PhD program. So we started with a simple question: what are the benefits and drawbacks of irrigated desalination? The idea of this question was simply to outline the possibility of desalinated irrigation, identify the potential problems, and more importantly, essentially trying to understand the feasibility of this practice in general. This sort of outlines the first year of my PhD, and this is sort of a recap, given that Luis has not joined us in the first, was not part of the first progress review plan, so I decided to do a very quick recap. So we decided to look at this from a couple of different angles. First, we wanted to see the past, present, and the future of desalination technology in general, and more importantly, identify some of the more pressing issues with this technology, especially if we want to expand it beyond its conventional use. In that context, it would mean using it for irrigation purposes. So we sort of did that. We tried to look at the history of desalination. More importantly, we looked at the current status, the more contemporary ways of we implement desalination in general, not only in terms of capacity, but also in terms of the units and how they're distributed around the world. The different technologies that are being used currently worldwide, the more practical cases of doing this practice. But more importantly, we talked about we identified some of the more pressing issues, some of the concerns, if you will. And we can categorize them into 3 different subjects. One being the environmental concerns, which ranged from the impacts these technology could have both in the intake and discharge zones, say the impact it could have on the marine systems due to changing the water quality as its discharge zone or increasing the water temperature, or potentially its role in exacerbating the climate change due to the fact that these are very energy-intensive technologies. It is important to note that while these are pressing issues on paper, on theory, for the most part, it seems that they're either negligible in most practical cases or can be managed through right tailor-fitted solutions. Well, then we have the agronomic concerns. Should we decide to use this for irrigation purposes, there are some issues that we should be aware of, given that the water quality profile of desalinated water is vastly different from conventional resources, both in terms of lack of certain elements or the abundance of others. So these could, on long term, have impacts on soil or crops. Again, it is important to note that for the most part, these are either negligible or can be managed. And lastly, we have the socioeconomic concerns. First, it's in some cases, we identify some bad perceptions or stigma attached to the idea of desalination, mostly due to misunderstanding about some of the concerns I mentioned earlier on. But as important, and perhaps more importantly, it's the high cost of desalination. Again, these are very energy-intensive technology. As such, they're usually innately very expensive to produce. And again, I sort of had to go through this review really fast, given that we didn't have much time. But if you're interested, you can scan any of these QR codes, or you can contact me. I can any of these, pretty much everything that I said have been published in these 3 papers. But essentially, the outline was I felt comfortable with the feasibility of this project in general. We found precedents. Spain and Israel have been already trying to implement this practice. But again, the main issue in all of these cases were the cost of desalination was really high. So the next logical question was, how can we bring down this economic and environmental costs? What are the opportunities arising from using desalinated water for irrigation? But more importantly, a way to solve this issue, the high cost, was to potentially leverage the presence of more affluent sectors, say mining industry, that are willing and capable in investing in desalination technology, and finding a way to bring down the overall cost of producing desalinated water for other sectors who cannot potentially afford it, say the agriculture sector. This brings out additional sub-questions, say, what are the marginal economic and environmental costs? How can we expand either of these sectors, whether the mining sector or the agriculture community, through this additional desalinated water? How can the energy market affect this system? And at the bottom line is, what is the cost of producing desalinated water under any of these setups? And again, the idea was to minimize the environmental and economic cost of producing desalinated water, at least to a point that it becomes more, it becomes easier for agriculture sector to benefit from desalinated water. And for the case study, we chose Atacama region. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, it's hard to explain why this is an ideal case, how eerie it is that this ideal case exists. Because first, the mining industry there is quite pronounced. It contributes greatly to the local and national economic situation. The agriculture, the region entirely have been facing with quite severe water droughts for a long time, and water scarcity for a long time, and as a result, the irrigation community have been suffering, and because of that, partly at least, there have been some conflicts over water rights between the mining industry and the irrigation communities. And as importantly, our great team have been working on this project for a long time, so the data set have been already provided to a great extent through the support of our team, both in SMI and SMI Chile, and most notably Liliana, who have gathered this great data set. And more importantly, what was important to me is that we could also look at both the active nodes, the sectors that are already active, but also the sectors that are coming in line, that they are already under consideration or are about to come in line, become operational, both in terms of the mining sites and desalination units. That becomes a crucial part in our research design plan. So what is the research design plan? How are we going to solve this? Essentially, the way you can look at this problem is a water balance system, meaning that you want to figure out how to allocate limited water that you have, in this case, desalinated water, to the demand sectors, in this case, particularly mining sector, but also gradually in the agriculture sector. It was important to us to understand both the status quo, the current situation, but also any potential expansion. In the case of demand sector, these mining sectors would be exclusion and inclusion of any potential sites that are about to come in line, become operational. But in terms of the agriculture community, we decided to start with 0%, meaning that 0% of the water, the current demands of agriculture is going to be met through this desalinated water. And we're going to expand this in 25% intervals, increase it to, say, reach 100%, meaning that all of the agriculture demand is going to be met through desalinated water, and go even beyond that to reach 200%, meaning that we're going to expand agriculture twice its current capacity, but meeting this water solely through desalinated water. What was important, but so essentially we're exploring the expansion of both these sectors explicitly, but the expansion in the desalination side is going to be explored implicitly, because whether that new units are going to be selected or which capacity they're going to work on, it depends heavily on the demand side and whether this selection is going to contribute either economically or environmentally. But it was also important to understand the impact of the energy market and the electricity price, because again, this is a very energy intensive technology. So the price of electricity is going to contribute to the overall cost. So this was also important to understand both the average case and some of the extreme cases in terms of high and low electricity prices. So how are we going to decide the setup to allocate this water? We're going to find the optimum setup through a series of optimization. How are these optimization going to work? Essentially, after we define that scenarios, we're going to have two sets of optimization. One being a spatial one, meaning finding a way between, finding a way to connect two nodes within a 3D space, considering the topographic information and things like this. But after that setup is created, meaning we have every optimum way, least cost pathways or potential pipelines that could connect these nodes, it is important that the best based on the scenario that we define, we select specific pipelines to allocate water based on that, again, based on that specific scenarios, which led to a series of codes and scripts and essentially an ecosystem of computational algorithms that we have developed here at SMI before me, and I continue to work on those scripts. So as I mentioned, given that the nodes have already been selected, we sort of had the LCPs or least cost pathways. But what was important is to optimize the network based on each given scenario that we're going to define. But when I say optimize the network, it is important to note that we're talking about a multi-objective optimization, given that we're trying to consider both the economic objectives in terms of the operational and capital cost of creating that infrastructure to allocate the water, but also the environmental objectives, which are the penalties associated with creating that infrastructures in terms of selecting that pipelines and going through specific regions which would be penalized based on studies that have been carried before me. So essentially, as I mentioned, we wanted to consider the mining situation, both in terms of status quo and expansion of mining industry, but also the agriculture sector. We wanted to see how the expansion of agriculture could affect this setup. And in addition to this, we considered 3 electricity price. A combination of these created 54 scenarios. And I recall distinctly that when we were talking about this pretty much a year ago, we were only considering 3 or 5 scenarios, but gradually we increased this number of scenarios to this, well, massive number. So these are the results. Each number that you're seeing is essentially the results of an optimization and a separate optimization. So essentially, we created that setup. We optimized the system, understand the economic and environmental, understood the environmental and economic impacts of that setup, summarize it here, and now we intend to explore what those numbers actually mean. So there are different ways to look at these numbers. First, what is important to me is to see the economy of scale, meaning that by the extension of any of these setups, essentially you would see that the overall cost of producing desalinated water, each cubic meter of desalinated water, both in terms of economic cost and environmental cost, are decreasing. But what makes it a bit more interesting is that you see that these 3 pillars, meaning the mining sector, agriculture sector, and the electricity price, are sort of intertwined to the point that it is hard to understand this behavior if you want to isolate the setup only on one sector. Say, essentially, you see that the agriculture sector, expansion in the agriculture sector, and support of this extension through desalinated water would bring down the overall cost of the cost of producing desalinated water for each cubic meter of desalinated water down. But how much this reduction is going to take effect, it depends on the electricity price or the expansion of the mining industry. Say, if the mining industry is working at its full capacity, meaning the expansions are considered, the cost of producing each cubic meter is essentially higher than the case that it's not. So these graphs, the results are quite interesting, and we can go on about the details, which I think I have in the documents, but for the sake of sticking to the timeline, I'm going to skip some of the analysis. But again, some of the more interesting things say to me is to see this jump here in the environmental costs, given that before inclusion of any of the agriculture sector, obviously we didn't see any environmental impacts. The environmental, we see the moment that we introduced the idea of agriculture desalinated, there is going to be a jump in the environmental cost, essentially because we're introducing new nodes. But essentially, if we expand the operation, meaning we produce more desalinated water for each of these nodes, the cost would gradually decline. The other way to look at these graphs was to look at the marginal cost, meaning the additional cost compared to the baseline being no water is going to be allocated to any of these agriculture nodes. Both these costs could be economic or environmental. Again, the idea of economies of scale can be apparent in these graphs. And you're sort of seeing that U-shaped graph, meaning at some point, these costs while these costs would go down by these expansions, essentially at some point onward, we expected these costs to go up again. And again, it was important to understand that the optimum setup based on the network consideration that we're going to have, you cannot isolate any of these sectors, these pillars. You have to have information about the mining, agriculture, and the electricity price to find the optimal setup, because based on the behavior of the two other sectors, the optimal setup for the other sector could change. Again, we're hoping to publish, we have already gone through the writing process of this paper and analyzing it. So hopefully in the next couple of months, we can publish these results as well. But after this, again, I felt comfortable with the results I found. This, to me, seems as a way to leverage the presence of the mining sector to bring down the cost, both in terms of economic and environmental, of desalinated water for the agriculture sector. This is a new way of looking at this, at creating an integral water management scheme, which could be a win-win for both sectors. In one case, we have the agriculture sector who can access a cheaper desalinated water. And in the mining sector, it can help them with the PR problems that they usually have, with the public image they usually have, mostly stemmed from conflicts over water rights. So it's essentially could be a win-win situation. That said, the cost of producing desalinated water is still the gap between the current prices that the agriculture sector is actually paying and the cost that we can bring down, even in the best case scenario through this, which we can, but in comparison to the cases that we're not expanding the system or not going through with this setup, the gap still exists. So it's not still there is something else needed to be added on top of this to make it a practical case. So depending on how much time I have, which I genuinely don't know at this point, whether it's a year or 2 years, we're going to address one or two more questions. The first one, which I hope I can address regardless of the timeline that I have, is going to understand how subsidy can be used as a mechanism to sort of bring down this gap to actually make this a practical case. Meaning that first, through such setups, we're going to create a collaborative way so that both mining sector and the agriculture sector could co-benefit from such water infrastructures and ultimately bring down the cost. Then through subsidy, make this a practical case to be implemented in practice in Chile, hopefully. So through that, there are a couple of sub-questions that needs to be answered. So say, if you're going to go through with this plan, whether mining sector should receive this subsidy or agriculture is a good question to answer, because say we can subsidize desalinated water for the mining industry as a way to incentivize to make it more enticing for the mining industry to invest in desalination technology in the first place, or we can subsidize the water for the agriculture sector so that the agriculture communities actually go for this plan. How much subsidy is going to be needed in either of these plans? Is crop selection is going to be a contributing factor in this case? And things like this could be interesting questions that I intend to explore in the next year. And again, the idea is to investigate the potential benefits of subsidizing the desalinated water for the agriculture community. So essentially, it's also worth noting that in the last 2 years, I've been trying to go out of my comfort zones, learn new techniques, mostly using any special tools, ArcGIS, mostly stuff which was a challenge for me. In the next year or so, I intend to explore some of the economic frameworks that we're going to use for understanding the concept of subsidy. I've also worked as a tutor or teaching assistant, depending on where you are. There are different names for it. But for different courses, again, given that I want to stay in academia, I thought that could be an interesting angle to explore. I've also started a new position as a research assistant, helping some of the SMI members. And in terms of publications, in the last 2 years, I've published 1 book, 3 editorial books. 1 has been published. 1 is going to be finalized in the next 3 or 4 weeks. 1, we have a new contract. Potentially have 8 book chapters, 10 published papers in the last 2 years since 2022, which I started my PhD. 3 of these papers were directly related to my PhD. There are 10 more on the way, hopefully sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, I haven't attended many conferences. In general, I didn't have the chance to do that, but hopefully in the next year we can sort of address that issue as well. And essentially, again, this part is sort of vague to me because I wasn't sure if I had 1 year or 2 years. But essentially, in the next year or so, I'm going to answer the 3rd question. If things goes well, hopefully I have another question which centers around the idea of water markets, which essentially is a way to bring everything together in terms of both water management schemes and socioeconomic mechanisms that we have identified as subsidies. But again, whether that becomes actual reality or not depends on UQ in particular. So yeah, for the next year, at least the plan is sort of clear. We're going to delve into the idea of subsidy and trying to figure out how we can leverage that idea to bring that cost even down. So let's meet the team. We have Neil, and I know I haven't changed Liliana's affiliation. It's really difficult for me to do that at this point. At any time I want to do that, I feel like they stole her from us. So I still refuse to do that. But in either case, we have Liliana and Neil from Australian side, and we have Slobodan and Razia, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. But they have, all of them have been nothing but support and joy to work with. And a massive shout out to Dion, Douglas, and Louise, who accepted our offer and they were kind enough to help us with this progress review. At any rate, if you have any questions or you want to contact me about any of my projects, please do so.